Rome. The year is 271 AD. 7,000 soldiers lie dead on the Gallian hill. Not on a distant frontier. Not in a war against the barbarians pressing the empire from every side. They are dead inside the capital itself, inside Rome. And the enemy that killed them did not come from the north, did not come from the east. It came from the imperial mint. The men who minted the money of history's greatest empire had risen in revolt. Led by a man named Felicissimus, finance minister to the Emperor Aurelian, they took up arms against the very state they served. History called this the Bellum Monetariorum, the War of the Moneyers. Stop and think about that for a moment. The greatest military power of the ancient world, capable of conquering from Britain to Mesopotamia, had to send entire legions to massacre its own mint workers. Why? Here is the thesis of this video, and I want you to hold on to it carefully, because the history we were taught in school is incomplete. Rome was not destroyed by the barbarians. Rome was not destroyed by moral decay, by Christianity, or by mad emperors. Rome was destroyed by a quiet administrative decision, repeated for decades by emperor after emperor, the systematic dilution of its own currency. And when the barbarians finally arrived in the 5th century, they did not bring down an empire. They buried a corpse. What's at stake in this thesis isn't just rewriting a chapter of ancient history. If Rome died by money, and you'll see over the next minutes that this is exactly what happened, then the economic history we were taught in school is incomplete. Worse than incomplete. It's convenient. Because if the pattern that killed Rome is the same pattern that repeats in every civilization that debases its currency, then understanding Rome stops being an academic exercise. It becomes a diagnosis, and the diagnosis applies to empires dead 2,000 years. But it also applies to something much closer to you than you'd like to admit. You're going to see, throughout this video, a sequence of numbers, coin weights, silver percentages, dates of assassinated emperors. These numbers form a graph, and that graph is Rome's death certificate, signed centuries before the official fall. To understand how Rome died, you first need to understand what Rome had. The Roman denarius was introduced around 211 BC during the Second Punic War, the same war in which Hannibal crossed the Alps with elephants. For nearly 250 years, the denarius was the most trusted currency in the Mediterranean world. Not by decree, by verifiable trust. Under the Emperor Augustus, who ruled from 27 BC to 14 AD, the denarius weighed about 3.9 grams, with silver purity around 95 to 98%. Practically pure silver. And here is the detail that changed everything. Augustus came to power after decades of civil war. The denarius during those wars had been manipulated, debased, devalued. Generals minted coins to pay troops, and purity collapsed. Augustus understood something few rulers in history have truly understood. The credibility of the currency is the credibility of the empire. He deliberately restored the integrity of the denarius, and he kept that integrity throughout his reign. Tiberius and Claudius, the emperors who followed, maintained the standard. For roughly 80 years, a Roman citizen anywhere in the empire, from frozen Britain to scorching Syria, knew the denarius in his pocket was worth exactly what it claimed to be worth. You could buy bread in Rome with the same denarius that bought wine in Alexandria. Merchants trusted it. Soldiers accepted it. Peasants saved it. It was real money. But in 64 AD, one specific emperor committed the act that would turn this solidity into a slow administrative poison. And from that act onward, nothing was ever the same. 64 AD. The Great Fire of Rome. The city burns for 6 days. Entire neighborhoods are reduced to ash. When the fire is finally extinguished, Nero must rebuild the capital of the known world. And the imperial coffers are exhausted. Between military spending on the frontiers, the imperial lifestyle, and Nero's own projects, there is no silver left to rebuild anything. So Nero makes a decision that would change Western monetary history forever. He reduces the weight of the denarius from 1/72nd of a Roman pound to 1/96th. And he reduces the silver purity from approximately 98% to about 90%. To the ordinary citizen, the change was invisible. The coin looked identical. Same emperor's face, same apparent size, same shine. But to the merchants and money changers who handled thousands of coins a day, people who knew the exact weight in their pocket, the specific sound of silver hitting a table, the difference was immediately obvious. Trust began to crack, quietly. And here is the part that matters. The silver saved in that operation, that invisible difference between what the coin claimed to be and what the coin actually was. That silver paid for the rebuilding of Rome, paid for the imperial works, paid for the palace lifestyle. It worked. It worked in the short term. And that is precisely why it became irresistible to every emperor who followed. What Nero did was not a one-off fraud. It was the opening of a door that led into a corridor where every subsequent emperor, at every fiscal crisis, every war, every prestige project, would discover that it was easier to shave off another sliver of silver than to raise taxes or cut spending. And once that door was open, no emperor managed to close it again. Trajan would inherit that open door. And what happened over the next 130 years is the most brutal evidence ever recorded of how a small administrative decision becomes civilizational collapse. But wait, someone could object. Rome fell in 476 AD, right? Nero died in 68. That's 400 years between one event and the other. How can a decision about silver explain a collapse 4 centuries later? Aren't you being dramatic? Aren't you forcing a simple narrative onto a complex phenomenon? This is exactly the argument traditional historians use to dismiss the monetary explanation. And it is exactly where they're wrong. The answer is uncomfortable. Rome did not fall all at once in 476. Rome had already fallen, monetarily, almost 200 years earlier. The Western Empire of the 5th century was a walking corpse, sustained by institutional inertia. When the barbarians came in, they didn't bring anything down. They found a skeleton dressed as an empire. The death of the Roman economy happened during what historians call the crisis of the 3rd century, between 235 and 284 AD. And that death was caused by the brutal acceleration of the very same process Nero began. And here is the part that's both fascinating and terrible at once. The numbers of that collapse are so precise that modern historians can map the fall of the empire by plotting year by year the silver content of the coins. You're about to see that graph, and it is more brutal than any battle you ever learned about in school. Trajan, 98 to 117 AD. Denarius purity falls to about 85%. The empire is at its absolute territorial peak. The borders have never been wider. From the outside, glory. From the inside, the corrosion begins. Marcus Aurelius, 161 to 180. The philosopher-emperor, the author of the Meditations, the man many consider the supreme example of virtue and power. Even under his reign of Stoic virtue, the silver content drops another 4%. Why? Because he is paying for wars on the Germanic frontiers. Because the Antonine Plague, a devastating epidemic, is killing soldiers and taxpayers across the entire empire. Personal virtue does not defeat fiscal mathematics. And here is one of the hardest lessons in economic history. When the system offers you an easy door to solve a hard problem, even the best among us walk through it. Septimius Severus, 193 to 211. Purity collapses to roughly 50%. Stop and let that number land. In a single generation, the denarius went from a coin that was predominantly silver to a coin that was predominantly other metals dressed as silver. 50% of the promise stamped onto the coin itself. An official lie, struck in metal, guaranteed by the state. Caracalla, 211 to 217. And here the empire takes a step no empire before had dared to take. Caracalla introduces a new coin, the Antoninianus. Officially, the Antoninianus is worth 2 denarii. That is the imperial decree. But the Antoninianus contains only the silver equivalent of 1.5 denarii. It is the first pure act of creation, adding nominal value without adding real value. Accounting manipulation in the form of struck metal, with the emperor's face stamped as guarantee. If that sounds familiar to you, it should. And from 250 AD onward, the fall becomes vertical. In just 50 years, silver content drops from about 40% to less than 5%. By 270 AD, the coins circulating in the largest empire on Earth were essentially copper with a thin silver wash on the surface. And here is the detail that makes this story almost unbearable to picture. When those coins circulated for a few weeks, passing hand to hand, spent in markets, handled by laborers, the silver wash wore off. The citizens of the Roman Empire watched with their own eyes the silver of their coins slipping through their fingers. Picture the ruin of trust. Picture receiving your wages in coins that change color before the end of the month. This is the scene one specific emperor walks into, attempting to do the impossible. Reverse the tide. What happened to him reveals everything about how monetary systems die. 270 AD, Aurelian becomes emperor, and what he inherits is, quite literally, impossible. The empire has physically split into 3 pieces. To the west, the Gallic Empire has declared independence. To the east, the Palmyrene Kingdom, ruled by Queen Zenobia, controls Egypt and Syria. In the middle, Rome, shrunken, surrounded, with a currency no one accepts anymore. Aurelian is a general, brutal, efficient, disciplined. He does the impossible militarily. In 5 years, he reconquers both lost halves and reunifies the empire. But during that campaign, he discovers something that makes him furious. The mint at Rome was producing coins worse than the ones officially authorized by the government itself. Think about that for a moment. The state was already debasing the currency officially. It was already reducing silver content in a planned, decreed way. But the mint workers, led by Finance Minister Felicissimus, were stealing even more silver. They were striking coins with less precious metal than the already reduced authorized level, and pocketing the difference. It was monetary fraud inside the imperial monetary fraud. When Aurelian confronts Felicissimus, the minister knows he will be executed. So he plays the only move he has left. He incites the mint workers to revolt. What follows is one of the strangest battles in Roman history. Imperial legions fighting against moneyers and treasury officials in the streets of Rome, on the Gallian Hill. Not a war against an external enemy. Not a provincial rebellion. The empire against its own mint. The system fighting itself. 7,000 soldiers dead, according to Aurelius Victor and the Historia Augusta. The mint at Rome is shut down for 2 years. Felicissimus is killed. And Aurelian writes a letter to his adoptive father, preserved to this day, in which he says with palpable exhaustion, "A revolt within the city has stirred up for me a most grievous struggle." In 274 AD, Aurelian launches his monetary reform. He establishes that every Antoninianus must contain exactly 1 part silver to 20 parts bronze. The famous mark 21, or Ka in Greek, struck on the bottom of post-reform coins. An official guarantee, engraved into the metal, that this coin contains what it claims to contain. Technically, the reform was a success. The post-reform coins really did contain the specified content. But economically, it was a devastating failure. Prices did not come down. Inflation did not subside. Trade did not recover. And the reason is simple and terrible. Once trust in the currency is broken, No technical reform brings it back. The Roman citizen who lived through the debasement, who got paid in coins that changed color, who watched his savings vanish, who learned firsthand that metal struck by the Roman state was a broken promise. That citizen never trusted again. Merchants began to prefer direct barter. The government began paying soldiers in land and grain because money no longer had value. The Roman monetary economy, which had unified the Mediterranean for centuries, regressed to pre-Roman levels. And Aurelian? He was assassinated in 275 AD by his own officers, 5 years after he tried to fix the system. The reform survived less than a decade. Back to the question that opened this video. Why did 7,000 soldiers die in Rome in 271 AD? Not in a war against the barbarians, not on a distant frontier, but inside the capital itself, against the state's own employees. The answer is now heavy with evidence, because the empire had reached the point where its own mint was a battlefield, because the currency had become so degraded that corruption inside the corruption looked normal, because the Roman monetary system had become a structure rotted from within, held up only by the brute force of imperial authority. Back to the thesis. Rome was not destroyed by the barbarians. The barbarians invaded an empire where money no longer circulated in parts of its own territory, where soldiers were already being paid in goods and land because money had no value, where internal trade had regressed to pre-Roman levels. The barbarians of the 5th century did not conquer Rome. They occupied the ground where Rome used to stand. The military fall was the death certificate. The real death happened century by century, decimal by decimal, in the falling purity of the denarius. It was a death so slow that no one lived long enough to see both its beginning and its end. Each generation saw only the small fall of its own time, thought it was just a passing crisis. Every generation was wrong. Here comes the uncomfortable part. Before we close this story, I need to show you something the numbers alone cannot show. When a currency dies, it does not die alone. The debasement of the denarius did not corrupt only the Roman economy. It corrupted horizons. When you don't know what your currency will be worth next year, you stop planning for next year. Long-term contracts vanish. Loans become a mathematical impossibility. Fathers stop bequeathing monetary value to their children because the value evaporates before the inheritance arrives. The Roman army of the 3rd century began being paid in grain and land because wages in denarii had become fiction. Rents went back to being collected in oil and wheat. Long-distance trade, the very thing that had unified the Mediterranean for centuries, collapsed because no one would accept future payment in a currency that lost value between order and delivery. And here is the hardest lesson of this story, the one economics textbooks don't like to teach. The dilution of money dilutes public morality. When the state strikes a broken promise and demands it be accepted as truth, it teaches the entire society to operate inside the lie. Administrative corruption explodes in 3rd century Rome not by coincidence. It explodes because the monetary system itself had become an official fraud. When money lies, every other institution learns to lie along with it. The story you just heard happened over 1,700 years ago. The emperors are dead. The mint on the Gallienus hill is a tourist ruin where visitors take pictures and leave without understanding what happened there. But the mechanism that killed Rome did not die with Rome. It just changed clothes. In 1913, the United States dollar was backed by gold. Today, it is backed by institutional trust, a promise that cannot be weighed, measured, or verified by any ordinary citizen. Since that date, the US dollar has lost more than 96% of its purchasing power. 96%. That is a worse number than any denarius from the era of Septimius Severus. On August 15th, 1971, the last formal link between the dollar and gold was severed. The Nixon Shock. From that moment forward, no major currency on earth was backed by anything more solid than the word of its government. Rome's mint took 2 centuries to break the silver promise. the modern world broke the gold promise in a single afternoon television broadcast. The euro, launched in 1999, has expanded its monetary base by more than 400% over the last 2 decades. The European Central Bank prints money to cover debts that markets no longer want to finance. The Roman mint struck bronze and called it silver. The European Central Bank creates euros and calls them reserves. The vocabulary changed. The mechanism did not. And the British pound, the world's reserve currency for most of the 19th century, the symbol of monetary discipline, has lost over 99% of its purchasing power since 1900. 100 years ago, a pound was a pound. Today, a pound is a memory of a pound, dressed in modern paper. The difference between Rome and the present is not the mechanism. It is the speed and the vocabulary. Where the Romans diluted silver, modern central banks print digital currency. Where Nero needed a physical mint and workers to shave the content off each piece, today it takes a single accounting entry on a computer. Where the Roman debasement took 200 years to become collapse, modern debasement could take… how long, exactly? Rome had the advantage of not knowing what it was doing. We have the disadvantage of having their example in front of our eyes and repeating the experiment anyway. The question that the Roman moneyer of 271 AD could not answer is the same question you need to answer today. When trust in money breaks, does it come back? The answer Aurelian gave the world, with 7,000 dead on the Gallian Hill, was no. If this story changed the way you understand the present, this channel exists for that reason. History is not the past. It's the manual no one read. I want to know what you think in the comments. Which modern currency do you think is closest to the point where Aurelian found himself in 271 AD? The dollar? The euro? Comment below. And tell me why. Subscribe. History remembers the kings. We follow the money.